Hello everyone. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to install Istio in a single mesh but multi-cluster mode on your local machine. I'm using Mac to do the demonstration. I have seen many materials online talk about how to deploy multi-cluster on the cloud service like AWS or deploy a single cluster on your local machine, but I don't find people talk about how to deploy multi-cluster on a single machine. So I think the challenge is that when you create multiple clusters on your local, popular solutions are Minikube or Kind. These two clusters will have their private IP range, and they can have IP conflicts, but you cannot directly connect one workload in cluster A to another workload in cluster B because these two networks are not connected. So in order to make two clusters communicate with each other, each cluster need to expose a gateway to the external of the cluster, which means that on your local cluster, you need to have two public IP address, and normally that is not possible. Right now, with some solutions, we can make this possible. I'm going to show you how to do that. So first step is if you go to the install multi-cluster page on Istio, you can see this. So today I'm going to go through this document step by step with you. What I'm going to demonstrate is install the primary remote deployment mode on different networks because on my local two kind of cluster, we have different network. And I'm using primary remote, which I'll explain later. But before you move forward, you should look at the before you begin section of the document. In this part, basically, first step is you need to create two kind clusters and set some environment variable to context cluster 1 and context cluster 2. So we can do it like this. I'll name the first cluster C1, and second cluster will be named C2. So after that, the next section is configure trust. So you go to the certificate management page, and here we are going to use plugin CA certificates. And this diagram demonstrates what it means. So basically, you need to have a shared root CA for both cluster, and you create immediate CA for each cluster and generate the workload certificate based on the intermediate CA. So let's follow the step here. So first, you need to create a certs directory and go into there to generate the root CA. And now you can see that we generated the root certificate. Then using this command, you can generate the intermediate CA for cluster 1 and do the same step for cluster 2. And now you can see we have a cluster 1 and cluster 2 folder containing the certificates for both clusters. And now in each cluster, you need to create the issue system namespace and create the secret containing the certificate in each cluster. So let's do it for cluster 1 first. So first I need to switch to cluster 1 and run the command. Then we switch to cluster 2. And here, when you follow the steps, you need to change the file to cluster 2. Then you can install Istio using the demo profile. Let's go to cluster 1. So if I turn on the dashboard, I can see that the Istio control plane is running. So it looks good. And now let's move on to deploy sample services and verify the certificates. In cluster 1, I can create the full namespace, which contains several services. And we can change the authentication policy between workloads. And next, we can verify the certificates following the steps here. So it looks like first step is we are going to capture the certificates out of a request and store that in a TXT file. And here we got the output. And you can see that in the documentation, it says if you see this num equals to 19, this is expected. So let's pass the certificates on the certificate chain. And there is a command you can run, but this command is designed for Linux system. Because I'm using Mac, I need to change the seed to gseed. and awk to gawk. You can install that using Homebrew. So seems that I generated the PEM file from the certificate output txt file. And now we can use OpenSSL to validate the certificate. We paste the commands, and we got these two are identical, which is exactly the same as a doc. So just now we verified the root certificate. Now we can verify the intermediate CA. Paste the steps, and we can see these two are identical also, which is expected. And we verify the searching from root certificate to the workload certificate. And it's also the same as the documentation. So this step is done. So which means the trust chain works as we want. Then we completed the before you begin step. Now finally, we can move on to the install primary remote on different networks. So first thing we notice from the documentation is that it says if you are testing multi-cluster setup on kind, you can use Metal LB to make use of external IP for load balancer services. I'm not using Metal MB because after I read through the documentation, I found it's a little bit tedious to set up. I found another solution, which is called Cloud Provider Kind. So basically, this provides the same functionality as Metal LB. It will generate local IP address separated for your load balancer services on Kubernetes cluster. So let me just create another session on the terminal. We can make it a little smaller, and we can run the cloud provider kind. We can just let it run in here. Then we can move on to install Istio. And here is also a diagram demonstrating how this primary remote works on different network. So you have a single mesh containing two clusters, and these two clusters are on two different networks. The primary cluster runs the control plane, and both cluster has a gateway for traffic go into and go out of the cluster. So when service A in cluster 1 want to query service B, as you can see from the diagram, the service A first need to send traffic to the gateway of cluster 2. The gateway authenticated the request, then forwarded the request to service B inside cluster 2. Also, you can see that the control plane on cluster 1 is connected to API server on both clusters. So basically, the control plane is reading the endpoint resources from both clusters and aggregate them. Then this information is published to the workloads on the whole mesh. So since we are going to apply some commands on both clusters, let's first export the environment variables for the cluster name. This is a name for our first cluster, and this is a name for our second cluster. The next step is to configure cluster 1 as a primary. So let's copy the command here. And it writes something into cluster1.yaml. Then we can use Istio control to install this operator on cluster 1. Looks like it's completed. And here we can see on cluster 1, the ingress gateway of Istio is a load balancer service, but it has an external IP. So this is with the help of the cloud provider kind command. You can actually access the service using curl on your local and hitting this IP address. Now let's install the east-west gateway on cluster 1. So you follow the command here. It says the east-west gateway is installed. And you can see we have a east-west gateway here, and it's a different IP address. If you follow this command, you can check the east-west gateway. Next step is to expose the control plane in cluster 1. So we run this command to expose control plane. And now we need to set the control plane cluster for cluster 2. We run this command. Looks like it's telling cluster 2 that the control plane is located on cluster 1. So here you can see Istio system already exists because just now we created the secrets of certificates on cluster 2. Now we need to set the default network for cluster 2, and it's setting it to network 2. And remember, just now when we install Istio on cluster 1, we were also telling cluster 1 that the network is network 1. So next step, we need to configure cluster 2 as a remote cluster. We first need to get the discovery address, and looks like it should be set to the east-west gateway IP address. So let's run this command, and let's check what's the address. So you can see this address is exactly the same as the east-west gateway external IP from cluster 1. And we need to tell cluster 2 that when it's trying to connect to the control plane, they need to connect to the east-west gateway of cluster 1. And we can use this manifest to install Istio on cluster 2. We can see that the profile is remote, and we are telling it the discovery address. And looks like it's installed. So now we need to attach cluster 2 as a remote cluster of cluster 1. And there's a long documentation you can read. Let's follow the commands. So when you run it, I noticed there is a message saying that seems that one of the server address looks like it's not reachable from the cluster. In order to see what happened, let's just run the first part of the command. And you can see there is a server address here is pointing to localhost. So following the documentation, it means that this command is trying to tell cluster 1 how to get the Kubernetes resources from cluster 2. So there is a server address need to be set here, and it should be the IP address of the API server on cluster 2. So that's why this is not reachable. In order to get the correct server address, we can go to the dashboard and check the API server IP address on cluster 2. So we are already on cluster 2. And if we check the port, we can see that API server has this IP address. So what you need to do is set the server address like this. So I tried several solutions, and I found that we have to use HTTPS protocol. And also, if you take a look at the description of the API server, this server is only exposing 6443 secure port to the external world. So that's why here we need to set 6443 as a port number. So if you create a remote secret like this and apply on cluster 1, that should be fine. So my understanding is that the API server on cluster 1 need to go through the east-west of cluster 2, but using this IP address to point to the API server on cluster 2. After that, you also need to install east-west gateway on cluster 2. And we need to wait for a while and wait for the cloud provider kind to assign a new IP address to the east-west gateway. And looks like it's completed. So if you check all the services on cluster 2, we can see the east-west gateway is installed, and it also has a dedicated external IP address. Now we need to expose services in cluster 1 and cluster 2. So we do this step. This step only exposing the services on cluster 1 to the external world. And here we have an explanation that because cluster 2 is installed with remote profile, exposing services on the primary cluster will expose them on the east-west gateway of both clusters. Now we need to verify the cross-cluster traffic. So we go to the verify the installation section of the doc. So first thing is that looks like we need to deploy Hello World service on both clusters. So let's follow the steps. So create sample namespace, label the namespace with the Istio injection, deploy Hello World services. So now we create a deployment on both cluster. And on cluster 1, we will deploy Hello World v1 and confirm it's running. Okay, Hello World v1 is running. And now we need to deploy Hello World v2 on cluster 2. Okay, now Hello World v2 is running on cluster 2. Then we deploy a curl service on both clusters. And ensure they are running. So the curl pod is running on both clusters now. Now we can verify the cross-cluster traffic. And we are using the curl command on cluster 1 to send traffic to Hello World service. So what they expect is if you repeat this command, you should see the result toggle between version 1 and version 2, which means the traffic is distributed between cluster 1 and cluster 2. And we already got the version 1 response from Hello World service, and we send the request on cluster 1. Let's run it again. And we have version 1 in the next request. And we run it several times, we can see that the response is toggling between V1 and V2. So this works. And you can repeat the process on cluster 2. So let me clean the screen. Let's run it on cluster 2. And you got V1 and V2. So there you go. You have a multi-cluster on a single mesh deployed on your Mac. So with this deployment, what you can do is experimenting with many of the multi-cluster features on your local machine, and you don't need to depend on cloud cluster anymore. So this is very convenient. And in the future, I may publish some videos regarding some other Istio features, like ambient mesh, something I'm interested in. And see you in the next video.